Okay, welcome. Welcome, everyone. It's about 3 or 4 minutes past 2, so I thought I'd sort of bring us to order. So, in the true spirit of the art of the possible, this session is Brexit, the opportunities. Savita said to me, would you mind chairing a session? And I was like, well, I'd be delighted. And then she said what it was, and I just thought, I can see none. But, however, to work across many European projects, obviously that's a gut reaction. In actual fact, we have, since June 2016, as we all know, we've been on something of a political and emotional roller coaster, and uncertainty still rules the day, but within that mass uncertainty, there are indeed opportunities. So in this session, we are focused on those opportunities. We have to avoid any debates whatsoever about whether or not there's going to be a deal, whether there's a deal or not. Anyone who mentions the word referendum, you have to go and sit in the naughty corner for a while, okay? Because it's just not going to be possible to. We don't want to sort of divide people. What we want to do is bring everyone together. So nothing is ever certain, but as things stand, we are saying that on the 29th of March, Friday the 29th of March 2019, we will be leaving the European Union. We are unwinding 40 years of membership and all the economic and political and social integration of those 40 years. So are there opportunities? Of course there are. Of course there are. So to discuss this and more, we have our 2 speakers today who will be speaking back to back, and then we'll be indulging in some discussion from the floor. To my left I have Alex Rader, who has been at the National Trust since 1989, heading a team of land management, heading a team of land management conservation specialists that actually advise National Trust properties across Devon and Cornwall, and is currently shaping a nature and access strategy for the southwest coast, which is fantastic. And a little further away, hi Tom. Tom Appleby is an associate professor at UWE, University for West of England, trustee and head of legal affairs at the Blue Marine Foundation, and therefore has considerable experience of high-profile marine environment, legal and political engagement. So I'm going to pass over to Alex first, if you're happy. Do you have a lapel mic there?
I do.
Great. Put this down.
Gosh, yeah. Yeah, hi. I'm Alex Rader, and yeah, it does feel feels quite weird actually talking about the positive aspects of Brexit myself, but I'm going to. And I was a little unsure of the audience and your background, where you all came from. So I thought it might just be really useful to rehearse some of the stuff around the Common Agricultural Policy. You're all familiar with that, aren't you? That aspect of the European Union's sort of land management and agricultural policy over the last, 40 years. And just reflect a bit, if you like, on some of the biodiversity declines, some of the environmental declines that have taken place in this country, but also throughout Europe over the last 30 or 40 years. And I guess, you can't point all of that at the Common Agricultural Policy. It'd be really interesting to know what would have happened in its absence. Would we have done more or less exactly the same things? I mean, that's a big what if. But just reflecting on it, these are a number of headlines that have come out, apart from the David Attenborough quote right at the top, a number of headlines that have come out over the last 6 months or so. And, we are living at the moment, it feels like, through a kind of biodiversity crisis, an absolute critical point that's been, well, it's been a long time coming, it's been a long time forecast, but, we are really beginning to hit the buffers now. And how much of that is the Common Agricultural Policy? I don't know, but it's interesting to reflect that a lot of these similar declines to this are taking place now in parts of Europe. Bird life in particular reporting massive declines in once much more common birds. There's reports on insects in Germany, etc., etc. Anyway, so huge losses in biodiversity. This is George Monbiot's famous tweet of the UK after a major rainfall event 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was, and topsoil washing out into the Severn Estuary and out into the North Sea and out into the English Channel. again, you know, a reflection of a policy and a industrial farming system that has gradually crept up on us as part of the common agricultural policy. And you could argue that, you know, that whole political direction towards seeing rural policy entirely through the prism of farming, you know, has led us potentially to this point. So, what about Brexit? A bit of a leading point, but is the environment going under a bus? Well, you know, if you listen to Michael Gove at the moment, it's really, really positive stuff. But there are a lot of other colleagues in the cabinet who've got different views on what might happen going forward. There does seem to be very much a sort of good angel, bad angel debate going on within the Conservative Party, at least. And you just don't really, and I'm just reflecting, you know, I haven't really thought about this before, but you don't really seem to hear about the environment in this whole Brexit, you know, he said, she said, you know, I'm right, you're wrong, kind of shouting match. So that's an interesting thing to reflect on from a communication perspective. And then I thought I'd just touch on, you know, some of the impacts, the potential impacts. We don't know, is the honest truth, what exactly is going to happen. But the NFU produced their own study into three broad Brexit scenarios across a whole spectrum of farming enterprises. And the big thing is obviously trade and subsidy. And, you know, wherever you stand politically, once we come out of the European Union, that £3 billion that is currently paid in direct and indirect subsidy to farmers and landowners in the UK probably feels like that's going to be up for grabs, really, you know, politically, when you think about the competing interests of the NHS, of education, of defence. It suddenly becomes a lot more transparent, a lot more visible. It's not something that was just there, done to us. All of my working life, the common agricultural policy has been there in the background like an elephant in the room. You just shrugged your shoulders and carried on. It was always there. You didn't really have much say or influence over what happened to it. But now it's going to become a lot more transparent, and it is in the national, you know, grasp to do what it likes with it. But it will be competing against a lot of other stuff. And just how many votes are there, you know, in a very dispersed farming and landowning community going forward? So what are the potential impacts? And I'm just, my colleague will talk more about the marine side of things, but I'm just sticking to the terrestrial side of things for the time being. But in terms of farming and land use, you can just see a lot of the existing trends that we've seen for a long time. So the kind of restructuring that has taken place under the radar of the common agricultural policy really beginning to accelerate. I.e., you know, farms getting some farms getting a lot bigger, perhaps having a very smaller set of farms at the other end, which are highly diversified, niche, you know, producing niche products, but a kind of great hollowing out of the centre of the family farm, you know, that we all like to, well, still does exist, but we certainly exist in the public imagination. And the possibility of a two-tier countryside as well. That is a really strong theme that seems to be coming out in all the debates around the agriculture bill, around the 25-year plan for the environment. But the idea beginning to coalesce that certain areas will continue to receive subsidy and support, others will be let go to the extent of, you know, being more able to do what they may need to do to be really productive. And the potential for a two-tier food market. You know, with the best food in the world, we can't all shop at Waitrose. And the big debate is, you know, how much on that trade side of things, how much in terms of imports are we going to allow in, and what is the nature of those imports? What's the quality? You know, the chlorine washed chicken and the hormone beef, all of that. And could we be moving towards an entirely new type of ideas around land management and nature conservation? We've been fixated for so long, for so many years, in very historical patterns of biodiversity and historical patterns of land use. And is there the potential to think about something new? and about, you know, perhaps setting aside bigger areas almost purely for nature. And in terms of the existing communication that's coming through on all of that, well, this is just a list of headlines. Nothing that's terribly informative. The headlines are always feeding some political point that someone wants to make about good or bad, Remainer, Leaver, you know, you're right, you're wrong. There is no real communication about, you know, what are the issues, what's up for grabs, how do we make this the most positive thing that it could be, or, you know, what are the real potential losses and impacts of leaving the European Union, or potential gains. They tend to be single issues that are picked out to bolster or justify a political standpoint, normally quite outside of environmental considerations. So this environmental protection, a whole heap of laws will be, well, they will be enshrined, we're told, within UK law as we leave. But what happens to them next is again a massively moot point. And whatever you think of the European Union, some of the stuff that it has done around biodiversity protection, around clean air, soils, etc., clean beaches, seems to have been really, really beneficial. But there is quite a big voice within the Conservative government in particular that would like to slash environmental regulations by quite a long way, and would like to, you know, get rid of a lot of the green goo or crap or whatever it's referred to, in order to really free up competition and free enterprise. And some really good stuff as well. I mean, this is a specific set of points around the 25-year plan for the environment that Gove has produced, which, you know, frankly, the National Trust as an organisation could have actually written that. The idea of nature recovery networks, 500,000 hectares of new habitat, you know, what's not to like about all of that? But of course, what is actually going to happen as it goes through, you know, Parliament, and as it goes through the lobbying of different interest groups and stakeholders. But on the face of it, you know, it's one of the greenest promises that have ever been made in respect to land management and the wider environment. And as I was alluding to earlier, I mean, is there the scope here to think about something genuinely different, something much more nature-rich, something much less reliant on historical patterns of biodiversity and land use that we've had? And I'm just, again, I suspect most of you have heard of the net wildland in Sussex, and this idea of a sort of rewilding. It's not a, you know, it's not wolves and bison, but it's letting nature go, if you like. And whether you do it deliberately and you get paid to do it, or whether it happens as a result of the economic changes that are brought about by Brexit, there is some potentially really exciting stuff there about nature's recovery if you give it the space and room to do that. So, in terms of communication issues, the point I'd really like to get across is that it does feel that somewhere out there there is a really significant opportunity to make things better. But what you're trying to do is communicate very complex, multi-tiered issues that impact across a whole broad range of stuff that is very close to people. So culture, environment, obviously politics, emotional responses to the countryside, to the future of farming, to the future of nature. It can be an incredibly complex technical and legislative area, which kind of explains the simplicity of some of the earlier headlines when it comes to trying to report what the potential impacts of Brexit might be. And in order to communicate well and in a kind of impartial and genuinely informative way, there has to be a way of cutting through the vested interests of all of these various stakeholder groups that are jostling and competing for attention. So it feels really important, and it feels like there's a real potential to communicate a kind of narrative of hope, you know, based on opportunity, based on the possibility of a better future. And for us, I suppose, as communications and environmentalist consultants or experts, Is it about creating the space for people to think positively? It's incredibly difficult at the moment. It's such a contested, rabidly heated environment, but it's the kind of thing that we've got to be thinking about. And yes, real political leadership will be required. But when all the heat and light goes out of, wherever we get to in March, maybe there is the opportunity to, in the settling dust, to actually have that more open debate, and hopefully we can be ready for it. And this idea of trying to develop a narrative that communicates across the divide of winner, loser, remainer, leaver, try to emphasise a constructive engagement with a future Europe. I mean, we may be leaving the European Union, but we can't geographically actually leave the continent, and we will have some relationship with both the European Union, assuming it exists, and Europe into the future. And is there something about using really good, knowledgeable advocates to communicate some of these more complex issues in a really simple and direct way? So that was me. Thank you. Thanks.
I don't know if anyone has any burning questions for Alex directly. But what we might do instead is have our second speaker now, Tom, stepping up to the stage.
So, yeah, Brexit. It's a sort of strange combination of stressful and boring. And I think probably a lot of people have been banned from talking about it at their kitchen tables. It's just one of those things that's too big to kind of for us to deal with as a whole, because it's just too complicated. And so any arguments about stay or leave disappear when you start going into the detail. The thing, what I've been trying to do is how you create a story that gets the other lot, the leavers, the people who aren't part of our gang, to articulate what you want them to say. So, and it's not terribly easy actually, but you probably have to take the whole Brexit word out of it and hit it obliquely. So, I mean, here's quite an interesting headline, for instance. We'll be in trouble. Fishermen fear hard Brexit could block £1 billion trade. Where do you think that came from? Which newspaper? Just speak up. What do you think? So where did that come from? Times, Guardian?
Mail.
Mail? No, not the Mail. Any advance on the Mail? Close.
Telegraph.
No. Daily Express. That is the only anti-Brexit headline I've seen in the Daily Express, and it comes from the fishing industry. So the marine world, it's interesting. If you tell the story, and it's a story, they will print it. So you have to go back to the storyteller's art. What we've done is, in the kind of panic of Brexit, people started going mad, really, and started doing the equivalent of screaming at one another. And you have to take a step back. And this actually, the chap that said this was a friend of mine, Mr. Sinclair, who's a Scottish fisherman who we've worked with for years. So we've got a relationship of trust with them. They just say what is, you've got to tell a story, and if you pitch it the right audience, you'll get there. So we need to remember the storyteller's art if we're going to do this, and then articulate the issues, and then there's a marvellous legal expression, res ipsa loquitur, the facts speak for themselves. And that will nudge people in whatever direction you want them to go, and you have the reassurance that you're saying the truth, whatever that is. So here we go, here's some founding myths. So the reason 92% of fishermen, when surveyed, voted to leave the European Union, or were going to vote for the European Union and don't vote afterwards, was to do with this founding myth. And it is largely correct. This isn't out of the Daily Express, this is out of this book here, the EC Common Fishing Policy by Church and Lowen. Basically, we couldn't join the European Union until Charles de Gaulle resigned in 1969. And then they did a very, very sneaky thing. Just before the UK joined, they all agreed, the six agreed, that all existing EU law, the acquis communautaire it's called, would apply to all new entrants to the EU. And then they did another very sneaky thing, which was just the day before the UK and Norway and Denmark and Ireland agreed to join the European Union. They did a common fisheries policy, which had a policy in it of shared access to all areas, which meant that when the UK, Ireland and Norway were about to join, suddenly those bearing in mind that back then territorial waters only went out to 12 miles, suddenly all those lovely waters from the UK and everywhere else would be accessed by French and German and fishermen, Belgian fishermen. So that was a nasty thing to do, and it was taken as a mean-spirited, not very clever thing to do, and caused terrible problems when we went into the EU negotiations. And the fishermen never forgot it. Then the next thing that happened was, and Norway got so cross about it, they didn't join. The next thing that happened was there's a decision in the EU about who joined. Now the exact word in the EU treaty about who had control of fisheries, where decisions over fisheries management were made. Now, if you think about it, the one thing you do not want to micromanage from a remote, centralised, landlocked location is fishing. And yet, the European Court of Justice, from some slightly dubious wording in the Treaty of Accession from the UK, decided on something which we would probably call competence creep, as in it pushed the boundaries of the wording on the paper to give the EU more power, to grant itself, through the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, more power over the member states. Which means from then on, that was in the mid-80s, the ECJ, the European Union, had exclusive competence over fisheries. And they delegated power back to member states, and it's hideously complicated arrangements. You would not want to do that. You'd want Europe setting the benchmarks of what's feasible. You would not want them micromanaging it. And so that is why 92% of fishermen, quite rightly, they're not idiots, they're not morons, they're just not. That's a perfectly legitimate reason to vote to leave the European Union, because the founding myth was based on bad faith. And here's where things go wrong, because what then happened is after we joined in the mid-70s, the exclusive economic zones, the areas of sea that countries control, went from 12 nautical miles to 200 nautical miles. So this common fisheries policy went from controlling out to 12 miles to a vast area of sea. Pi is involved in that, and squared stuff. So lots of maths, and you end up with a large area of sea that was controlled by this. And that so when you hear arguments of take back control, that is incorrect. We never had control over those waters, the majority of those waters, when we joined the EU, or European big common market as it then was. We didn't have that, so we can't take back control, which is important from a legal point of view, because you can't just shoehorn all the equipment and artifices of government that were there and put it back in place, because they never existed in the first place. So we have to design a whole new system. And then on top of that whole new system, we've got devolution as well, which makes life quantum more complicated. And it was, what also happened at the same time is this excluded the British distant water fleet from the Arctic or around Iceland where we used to fish, and that is what led to terrible redundancies in the fishing industry. So it was, what you have is, in the mind of the fisherman, you've got the conflation of two events. One is I do think it was outrageous behaviour of the EU when we joined, with the Cold War. They all get bundled into something about British fisheries collapsing. So that's that. That's the history, if you like. And on top of that, the EU Common Fisheries Policy didn't actually work. You've got this for ages. You can see this is the graph. You can see fish stocks. If you're at the back, you can see fish stocks bumbling around, and then after we joined, they just go down like that. This is fish landings in the UK. Until we get to the 2005, when they flat level out, and from then, they're flatlining. But they're not getting any worse. So after sort of 20 odd years, actually the CFP, the tragedy is the CFP had started to work. But because of this founding myth of bad faith, fishermen never liked it. They never loved it because they always felt it was imposed on them. And so, now it's per game. where we are now in this sort of mixture of fisheries and environmental legislation, these are the stories. These are the recent stories that are in the press, if you like, that are coming out of it. Let's play a game of EU saint or devil under these circumstances. So the first one is a story we got in the press. In fact, I did a legal complaint on this 2 weeks ago. And this is the experimental use of an electric pulse fishing technique in marine protected areas and special areas of conservation in the North Sea by predominantly Dutch but some British flagged fishing vessels. So, in the room, it is a terrible, oh, and what's worse, it's experimental and yet it's actually a commercial fishery with about 80 odd boats, something like that, doing it, and it's a fully fledged, they're landing on it's an experiment that is basically being sold in Tesco's. So, who is responsible for this absolute, this is you know, in the kind of, in the room with Japanese scientific whaling? Is this a British mess up or a European mess up? What do you reckon? Hands up. Hands up for British? Hands up for European? It is a European mess up, I'm afraid. This is entirely manufactured in Europe. It is a dreadful thing that the European Union fisheries do not actually uphold their own environmental law. That is appalling, and it's something that we could actually fix with Brexit, because we could force them to do it in our treaty of leaving. I'm going to Brussels next week to speak to the European Parliament. So that's that one. British scallop dredgers on the west coast of France. Now, scallop dredging is a particularly harmful fishing technique. It involves towing heavy gears across the seabed. The French have been doing it for a long time. They had a sort of gentleman's agreement with the British. The gentleman's agreement lapsed. And British fleets just turned up partly because of displacement from marine protected areas around the UK. So they've gone over to France and started hammering away at the seabed just off the French coast. Of course, that's an interesting one, we've had conflicted loyalties. I don't know how I frame this question. But is this a European problem or is this a British problem? So, hands up for European. Hands up for British. It is a European problem. It is the European law that allows us to there, but perversely you had Michael Gove standing up supporting British fishermen fishing off the west coast of France, which they were entitled to do under European law. Try and square that one. The Codfathers. The Codfathers is a fabulous story, which is some brilliant work by Greenpeace. Now this is, I'll just have to read out the statistics. I don't remember the statistics. But oh yes, so this means that, and I need to be careful, this is recorded, don't get libelled. 37% of the UK's fishing quota are wholly or partly owned by a tiny handful of wealthy families. Over half, 13 of the UK's 25 largest quota holders, are linked to one of the biggest criminal overfishing scams ever reached in the British courts. In Scotland, the concentration of fishing rights in the hands of the on-rich list families is even more acute. 5 families on Sunday Times rich list control a third of all Scottish quota. A third of all Scottish quota. Bearing in mind, Scotland has most of the UK seas, excluding the overseas territories. So whose responsibility is that? British problem? Or European problem? British? Don't people British? How many people think European? It is a British problem. This is homegrown. That is, in my view, the single most serious problem, and it is the complexity, I'd say 95% British, 5% EU problem. You could argue, the only argument I can think of is that actually the EU created such a complicated process that actually only very rich people could afford to play the game. But ultimately the system was created by the British, it's our problem. So that's ours. High Seas Treaty Negotiations. When we go into the High Seas Treaty Negotiations for 2020, who negotiates on behalf of us for these lovely conservation measures we're pushing forward? The UK or Europe? UK? Europe? Yeah, it is Europe. And it's quite interesting this, because it shouldn't be But because some of the competences are exclusive to the EU, it's easier just to get the European Union to do it on behalf of us. It's difficult to work out what member states' competence is. So there are some slivers of British bits that we could argue on, but by and large, it's easier for us just to lump ourselves into the EU. And then I've last one, and I'll pass on access for access because we've got a shorter time. But these are the sort of, once you get into the actual story, the position becomes quite complicated. And also, have you felt you're not so, the stress goes out of it slightly because you're starting to talk about real issues rather than theoretical issues. So what's needed? I think we have to step away from these bad losers versus idiots argument. I heard on Radio 4, I heard somebody standing up from the, I think it was Leave Means Leave campaign, to talk about the People's Vote referendum thing. Oh, they're just a bunch of losers. How was that allowed on the radio? Who commissioned? They must have known beforehand that was what they're going to say. I'm sorry, that's just not, that sort of language is stupid and it's not worthy of public debate, particularly on Radio 4, but I think I'd argue right the way across the media. We've got to step out of that kind of lazy, sloppy journalism, which is leading people into very emotional responses. It might sell newspapers, but it's not doing the country's mental health or economic health any good at all. So across that, we have to find different voices, and we have to go back to reporting the stories, and then just put Brexit as the subtext, and it's much easier. And the conservation sector, just do what you always did before. I've heard this wonderful word, bricoleur. I don't know if you've ever heard it. You make things by just using the tools that you have around you. Brexit is one of those tools. If you want to do some rewilding of the uplands, use Brexit. If you want to do, marine protected areas, use Brexit. We are using leaving the European Union as a way to try and rectify EU law on this disparities and misapplication, failure to apply environmental fisheries. So just use the people around you. So be aspirational, be non-partisan, and most of all, remember people. We have this terrible thing of one of the other projects we're working on in blue is marine parks, national marine parks. And that's because conservation got itself a bit too sciencey. It all has to be evidence-led and scientifically proven. And actually, appreciation of natural beauty, which is in the National Park Act 1947, which is beautiful language. They thought about that while they were being bombed. Wonderful language, wonderful aspirational stuff. Go back to that. Let people just take the stress out of this. And how we've put this into practice, and I suppose we Trojan horse this a bit at Blue. When the first Brexit vote happened, we were like, right, Charles Claver, my chair, said, public are never wrong. Tom, we were all sort of wandering around the office, our shoulders. Public are never wrong. Oh, you've got to crack on with this. Brexit, let's find out what it is. And so everyone was saying we need a new fisheries management system. And it turned out no one knew what it looked like. Well, of course you would. There's no academic research in the UK, really, about alternative systems, or none that we knew of. So what we did is we called a conference together of fishmongers in London, and we got all the world experts from Australia, New Zealand. We got the fishing industry to help us bring their people in from Australia, New Zealand, America, Norway, and Australia. And they did a brilliant talk. And that was great because we had to start to think about what the art of the possible was. We also realised actually some of the stuff the English inshore does is very, very good, which is certainly world leading. That was quite nice. But it meant we had a positive dialogue, which meant the next conference we did, which was Brexit in transit, fishing in transition, and how Brexit is going to work. We had earned the trust of the fishing industry. And what I didn't show, but I could have done, is we got a room full of 50 fishermen. We only pitched to fishermen, we didn't get the press in. We got a room full of 50 fishermen, sort of local leaders, if you like, and we explained absolutely accurately, to the best of our ability. Probably the best speaker was just a guy who was a local solicitor. He was brilliant. But he just knew the law. He wasn't partisan. He just put the facts on the table, that's what it was. And then let everybody make their own mind up. And we got everybody in the room, bearing in mind 92% of people, that was a very Brexit-prone audience, to basically say, well, the only option we can work with is the Norway option. So you can do it, but you've got to provide the breadcrumbs for people to get there. And that's been our approach. And so far, it's been very interesting, but quite successful. Thanks very much.
It's really nice not to have the usual doom and gloom sort of permeating through. So it feels very much like there is a significant opportunity here to really do something different, aspirational, something that thinks outside the box, something that needs to design perhaps a new system, something that's innovative, something that is possibly exciting, and Brexit is now, and that time to catalyse that change. So we've got about 20 minutes now, and I wanted to ask for your comments and reflections from the floor, because we have two experts here, but I don't think anyone's actually an expert in this realm.
No one knows what's going on at all.
So there is a genuine interest in your thoughts.